Okay, I'm having last class feelings. I think everybody is. So we have to tell Lori thank you for getting us through these very many weeks and many hours. Incredible, Lori. Amazing. And then, of course, this is David's day. And again, incredible, amazing, many hours of information. So we'll start with, like I can see already being done, clap our hands and he can hear them. Put your hands up, guys. Okay. And we usually have a gift bag, so I'm going to hold one up. But of course, I can't hand it to him, so it's kind of like checks in the mail. And we like to give our instructors gifts to say thank you. So David will be receiving it too. And we are so hoping he will come back, because we know that Harry Truman's not through. He hasn't even started his last term, second term, and maybe give us a teaser for next fall. So thank you, David, from all of us.
And to piggyback on that really quickly, David is a volunteer who has taught this class. All of our instructors are volunteers. If you are passionate about something that you would like to share with the rest of the Spark community, please contact me or Judy so that we can get you on our fall schedule so you can volunteer to be an instructor.
Right. This whole new way of doing things is going to bring out some different kinds of people. So that'd be wonderful.
All right, so off we go. Berlin Blockade, post-war Germany. It became clear as time went on to President Truman that Stalin and the USSR did not share any philosophical or ideological ideals or goals in common with the United States about post-war Europe. Stalin and the USSR demonstrated no interest at all in the rebuilding and reconstruction of devastated Europe, or the rebuilding and reconstruction of the world economy. Truman concluded that Stalin and the USSR were simply interested in establishing dominion and control over any country or geographical area that was unable to resist them. With regard specifically to defeated Germany, the Soviet Union was interested in punishing the Germans for the damage and devastation they had caused, so that they would no longer pose a military threat. And they were interested in obtaining reparations to repay the USSR for the damages it had suffered at German hands during the war. The place where the competing interests and ideology of the US and the USSR came closest to meeting head on was the defeated country of Germany and its capital city of Berlin. Germany and Berlin were divided into 4 zones of occupation at the end of the war. The creation of the original zones of occupation, that was based upon agreements reached between the leaders of the big 3 powers, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin, at Yalta in February of 1945, even before the war had come to an end. The US, Great Britain, France, at the insistence of the British, and the Soviet Union each occupied a zone, 4 zones. The American, British, and French zones together made up 2/3, the western 2/3 of Germany, while the Soviet zone comprised the eastern third. Berlin, the former capital, which was surrounded by the Soviet zone, was placed under joint 4-power authority, but was partitioned into 4 sectors for administrative purposes. An Allied Control Council made up of representatives from all 4 powers was to exercise overall joint control over the country. Now, just for reference purposes, the American and the British occupation zones were combined on January the 1st of 1947 into what was called the Bizone, or Bizonia, if you want a strange name for something. It wasn't until the middle part of 1948 that the French occupation zone was combined with the Bizone to create an area which became known as the Trizone. Later, on May the 23rd, 1949, the Trizone became the Federal Republic of Germany, commonly known as West Germany. As you can well imagine, putting Berlin and the country at large under an authority that included all four of the occupying powers, and expecting them to agree and or cooperate with each other concerning the treatment and governance of Germany and Berlin, was probably doomed from the start. Nevertheless, that was the original arrangement the parties created. And at the time of the agreement, they were allies working together with a singular goal of defeating the Nazi German regime. Now, the context for what happened in 1948 with regard to Berlin, original US policy. And those that have been with me before have heard this before, but it's not bad to hear this reminded. It's important to understand as we go back and set the context that it was not US policy to reconstruct and restore Germany to the modern family of nations at the end of the war. Let me repeat that. It's important to understand that it was not US policy to reconstruct and restore Germany to the modern family of nations at the end of the war. They had been our enemy. They had caused great damage, destruction, and loss of life. US policy toward Germany that developed under FDR influenced Stalin in his expectations of what US actions would be toward Germany and Europe as a whole following the end of the war. Henry Morgenthau was FDR's Treasury Secretary. US policy towards Germany in the immediate post-war period was conceptually formulated largely by Morgenthau. But he left the substance and the details of the policy to his deputy, Henry Dexter White, a fascinating character. You can read a little bit about him on that slide. White, it turned out, was either a communist or a communist sympathizer or just an outright spy. He was later accused of passing information to the Soviet Union and of being a spy for the Soviets. I'll mention that again later in a little different context. The policy of the US toward Germany in the immediate aftermath of the war was called the Morgenthau Plan. The essence of this policy, the Morgenthau Plan, was to deindustrialize post-war Germany, effectively to render the country pastoral, agricultural in its nature, and to make it infirm economically, so as to eliminate the risk that Germany would rise again in the foreseeable future as a world military power. Remember, World War I and World War II essentially were blamed on the Germans, at least by the West. The Morgenthau Plan was largely the basis for Stalin's expectations on what US policy would be toward Germany after the war ended, and for that matter caused him to conclude that he would be able to dominate and control a buffer of Central and Eastern European nations without interference from an indifferent United States and a weak and divided Western Europe. As we know, Harry Truman became president upon FDR's death on April the 12th, 1945. The Germans surrendered and victory in Europe was declared on May the 8th of 1945, just to put things in perspective. On May the 10th, 1945, and this slide contradicts that just a little bit, but anyway, in the spring of 1945, President Truman, newly inaugurated as president, signed what was called U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Occupation Directive, or JCS, number 1067. The directive, which was in effect for over 2 years, directed the U.S. occupation forces to, quote, take no steps looking toward the economic rehabilitation of Germany, essentially codifying the Morgenthau Plan as official U.S. policy. By mid-1947, 2 years later, for numerous reasons, many of which we've already talked about in this class and others, there was an about-face in the thinking of the U.S. State Department and consequently President Truman. That thinking changed with regard to the strategic importance of a rebuilt and reconstituted Germany to the future economic and political health and well-being of Europe. and for Germany to act as a bulwark against Soviet aggression and expansionism from the East. It was determined as part of that background of the policy that an economically healthy and rebuilt Germany was in the national interest of the United States. You can see how this 360-degree turn, or 180, I guess it would be, changed US policy completely towards Germany from what it was immediately after the war and for the first 2 years. This is a very important change in policy. You will recall in connection with this change in policy that Secretary of State George Marshall gave a speech at Harvard on June the 5th, 1947, which announced the United States proposal to help rebuild Germany with US assistance, which ultimately led to the adoption of the Economic Recovery Program / the Marshall Plan, which President Truman signed into law on April the 3rd of 1948. In July of 1947, JCS 1067, aka the Morgenthau Plan, was repealed and replaced by JCS 1779, which was in direct opposition to the previous JCS. JCS 1779 stressed that, quote, "An orderly, prosperous Europe requires the economic contributions of a stable and productive Germany." A far cry from the idea that we were not going to take steps to rebuild or rehabilitate Germany. As one can see in JCS 1779, a complete reversal in policy from the previous JCS. So as I said, this represented a steep change in policy toward the portion of Germany under the occupation of the United States, which in turn became the policy of the zones of occupation under the control of Great Britain and France over time. For 2 years following the end of the war, the recovery of Europe had stalled as Soviet totalitarian communism had established itself in the occupied territories. This was the point from which the Marshall Plan ultimately developed and was adopted as a policy of the United States towards Europe, or at least the non-Soviet occupied portion of Europe. Over time, the Morgenthau Plan, or JCS 1067, ran into opposition from Truman's Department of State, which very soon wanted a rapidly growing Germany to fit into its plans for economic restructuring and for a Europe-wide continental market for US goods that would do many of the good things that the continent-wide markets did for America in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. Additionally, to the State Department was the position of the War Department, soon to become the Defense Department, which, if they had to fight the Russians, wanted to fight them in the Fulda Gulf or in the ruins of Wurzburg, rather than fight them on the beaches of Long Island. Assistance from German industry and German military minds would also be welcomed as well by our Defense Department. The state and defense positions won out entirely and utterly and completely over the Treasury-based Morgenthau Plan, not only in the government as a whole, but with President Truman individually. As a result, we get JCS 1779 and the Marshall Plan, and ultimately the reintegration of Germany into Europe in its industrial, heavy economic role and the rapid drive for prosperity. It became clear with regard to post-war Germany that the clear policy of the USSR was the subjugation and punishment of any part of Germany it occupied or controlled, or what Germany had done in World War II. In addition, there was a belief that the USSR would look for ways to remove the Western Allies from Berlin first, and possibly then from the balance of the country which they occupied, to bring the entirety of post-war Germany within the Soviet orbit of control. This is an important assumption in understanding for you to keep in mind. From the Soviet standpoint, that goal would best be accomplished by having dominion and control over all of Berlin and all of Germany, something that Truman was not willing to allow to happen. Thus, we have the setup for the showdown that occurred over Berlin in 1948. As a point of reference, keep in mind that the Senate debate over the legislation to support the Marshall Plan took place from March 3rd to March 13th of 1948. Czech Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, who I talked in detail about last time, was found dead in Prague on the cobblestones underneath his apartment on the morning of March the 10th, 1948. After the Marshall Plan passed both houses of Congress, President Truman signed it into law on April the 3rd, 1948. At the very time the Senate was debating the Marshall Plan, Stalin began to put into action a plan to drive the Western Allies out of Berlin. On March the 9th, Soviet representatives in Berlin were summoned to Moscow. They were told that Moscow needed to disrupt Allied plans to put together a Western bloc, including Germany. Shortly thereafter, Stalin began authorizing a spiral of measures designed to asphyxiate the Western powers in Berlin. Restrictions on air, train, and auto traffic into and out of the city began early in 1948 and were ratcheted up as time went on. The apparent goal was to drive Western powers out of Berlin and cede control and occupation to the Soviets. The immediate excuse for Soviet behavior was the introduction of a new currency in the Western zones of occupation, including the sectors of Berlin occupied by the Western powers. This new currency was introduced on June the 18th, 1948. To keep things in perspective further as to what was going on in the US, as we discussed in our last class, the Republican National Convention was taking place from June the 21st to June the 25th in Philadelphia, and the Democratic Convention was scheduled to take place from July the 12th to the July the 14th. As we shall see, things were heating up in Berlin at the very time the Republicans were meeting in Philadelphia. On June the 19th, 1948, just 2 days before the Republican National Convention was to begin, Soviet guards halted all passenger trains and traffic on the Autobahn to Berlin, delayed Western and German freight shipments, and required that all water transport secure special Soviet permission. On June 21st, the Soviet military halted a United States military supply train to Berlin and sent it back to Western Germany. On June the 24th, the Soviets severed land and water connections between the non-Soviet zones and Berlin. That same day, they halted all rail and barge traffic in and out of Berlin. The West answered by introducing a counter blockade, stopping all rail traffic into East Germany from the British and US zones. Over the following months, this counter blockade would have a damaging impact on East Germany, as the drying up of coal and steel shipments seriously hindered industrial development in the Soviet zone. On June the 25th, the Soviets stopped supplying food to the civilian population in the non-Soviet sectors of Berlin, in essence taking steps to starve out the population. Motor traffic from Berlin to the Western zones was permitted, but this required a 14-mile detour to a ferry crossing because of alleged repairs to a bridge. The Russians also cut off the electricity relied on by Berlin, using their control over the generating plants in the Soviet zones. Back home, President Truman had just returned to Washington, D.C. on June the 18th from his non-political train trip out west to see the people we talked about last time. The Republicans had wrapped up their convention in the nomination of Dewey and Earl Warren for the president and vice president, respectively, and the Democratic National Convention, scheduled for July 12th through the 14th, was only about 2 to 3 weeks away. Surface traffic from non-Soviet zones to Berlin was blockaded, as I mentioned, leaving open only the air corridors. The Soviets rejected arguments that the occupation rights in the non-Soviet sector of Berlin and the use of the supply routes during the previous 3 years had given Britain, France, and the United States a legal claim to the use of highways, tunnels, railroads, and canals. Relying on Soviet goodwill after the war, Britain, France, and the United States had never negotiated an agreement with the Soviets to guarantee these land-based rights of access to Berlin through the Soviet zone. At the time of the blockade, Berlin had 36 days worth of food and 45 days worth of coal. Militarily, the Americans and British were greatly outnumbered because of the post-war scaling back of their armies. The United States, like other Western countries, had disbanded most of its troops and was largely inferior in the European theater. The entire United States Army had been reduced to about 550,000 men by February 1948. That was down from 12 million. Military forces in the western sector of Berlin numbered only about 9,000 Americans, 7,500 British, and 6,000 French in their respective zones. Of the 98,000 total American troops in West Germany in March 1948, only 31,000 were combat forces, and only one reserve division was immediately available in the United States. The 2 United States regiments in Berlin could have provided little resistance against a Soviet attack. Because of the imbalance, US war plans were based on using hundreds of atomic bombs, but only about 50 Fat Man specification bombs, the only version available to the US military, existed in mid-1948. In March 1948, only 35 silver plate atomic-capable Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers and a few trained flight and assembly crews were available. 3 B-29 groups arrived in Europe in July and August of 1948. Despite the intention to signal a threat of the West's ability to retaliate with nuclear weapons, if necessary, the Soviets possibly knew that none of the bombers were atomic capable. The first silver plate bombers only arrived in Europe near the end of the crisis in April of 1949. So Germany was essentially defenseless from a military perspective at the time of the Berlin blockade. General Lucas Clay, in charge of the US occupation zone in Germany, summed up the reasons for not retreating from Berlin in a cable to Washington, D.C. on the 13th of June, 1948. Quote, "There is no practicability in maintaining our position in Berlin, and it must not be evaluated on that basis. We are convinced that our remaining in Berlin is essential to our prestige in Germany and in Europe. Whether for good or bad, it has become a symbol of the American intent. The Marshall Plan had already been enacted." Believing that Britain, France, and the United States had little option than to acquiesce, the Soviet military administration in Germany celebrated the beginning of the blockade. General Clay felt that the Soviets were bluffing about Berlin since they would not want to be viewed as starting World War III. He believed that Stalin did not want a war and that Soviet actions were aimed at exerting military and political pressure on the West to obtain concessions, relying on the West's prudence and unwillingness to provoke a war. On the other hand, Commander of United States Air Forces in Europe, General Curtis LeMay, reportedly favored an aggressive response to the blockade in which his B-29s with fighter escorts would approach Soviet air bases while ground troops attempted to reach Berlin. Washington, Truman vetoed that plan. So what does President Truman tell us about the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift that followed in response? So this is President Truman talking to us now in his memoirs. In volume 2, President Truman writes, Russia was caught off guard by the Marshall Plan. Moscow quickly realized that when the Marshall Plan began to function, the opportunity to communize Western Europe by exploiting her economic miseries would be lost. Russia sought to retaliate by 2 moves. The first move was to set up a counterpart of a Marshall Plan under Russian auspices for her satellites. I found this cartoon comparing and contrasting the Marshall Plan to the Warsaw Plan, or at least in the eyes of this cartoonist. So at the top of that cartoon, you see the Marshall Plan with a tractor and a plow behind it, which is off the screen there, plowing and helping rebuild and send food to Europe, to help Western Europe at least be rehabilitated. At the bottom, you see Marshall's Stalin Plan with the person pulling the sickle plow in shackles, and that's the Marshall-Stalin Plan to rebuild Eastern Europe. Not terribly effective, quite frankly. So that was one of the things that that Stalin did in response to the Marshall Plan. This is again Truman writing. The second thing that was done by Stalin was to risk a military incident in Berlin designed to test our firmness and our patience. Under the provisions of the agreement reached at Yalta, the military government to rule Germany was to be jointly directed from Berlin. The Russians became less and less tractable, and on March the 20th of 1948, their representatives walked out of the Allied Control Council, which was the control agency for Berlin and for all of Germany. For the city of Berlin, this act, in other words, their walking out of that meeting, was the curtain raiser for a major crisis. Again, this is Truman writing. On March 31st, the deputy military governor of the Soviet Union notified our military government in Berlin that in 2 days, beginning April 1st, the Russians would check all US personnel passing through their zone for identification and would inspect all freight shipments and all except personal baggage. Our military government authorities rejected these conditions. Between April and July the 1st, Russian orders sealed off all highway, rail, and river traffic into and out of Berlin. I guess I jumped a slide there just a minute. Yeah, okay. What the Russians were trying to do was to get us out of Berlin. At first, they took the position that we never had the legal right to be there. Later, they said we had the right to be there, but that we had forfeited it. What was at stake in Berlin was not a contest over legal rights, although our position was entirely sound, but a struggle over Germany, and in a larger sense, over all of Europe. In the face of our launching of the Marshall Plan, the Kremlin tried to mislead the people of Europe into believing that our interest and support would not extend beyond economic matters and that we would back away from any military risks. General Clay was forced to make emergency arrangements to have essential supplies flown into the city, since Berlin by now was effectively blockaded by the Russians, both by land and by water. Here we go. By June 26th, I directed that this improvised airlift be put on a full-scale organized basis, and that every plane available to our European command be impressed into service. In this way, we hoped that we might be able to feed Berlin until the diplomatic deadlock could be broken. The airlift steadily expanded beyond what was happening there beginning on June the 26th. On August the 20th, it was reported that the combined British-American lift had averaged 3,300 tons daily, and that the maximum for any day's lift had now reached 4,575 tons. The stockpiles in Berlin were slowly growing. There was now a 25-day reserve of coal and a 30-day reserve of food in that city. On September the 9th, the National Security Council was informed that since early August, the daily average lift had been increased to 4,000 tons, and that it was likely that 5,000 tons a day could be reached if additional cargo planes were allocated. All the while, the Americans and the British continued to hold fruitless negotiations with the Russians in an attempt to resolve the matters diplomatically. So, in the context of our study of events during the year 1948, this is where the matter stood as summer turned to fall. The Russian blockade of Berlin continued, and the British and Americans continued to fly plane load after plane load of supplies to provide for the needs of the citizens of West Berlin. How would it all end? At the time, no one could say. President Truman was determined to stay the course, regardless of the pressure that was put on him by the Soviet Union. Andrew Bush gives us the following commentary on the Berlin blockade and the political impact of President Truman's reaction to it. The Berlin, and I'm quoting Andrew Bush here now in his book about the election of 1948. The Berlin blockade began less than 3 weeks before the opening of the Democratic National Convention. It was yet another forceful demonstration of Stalin's malevolence. Henry Wallace responded with a statement that the risks of running the blockade were too great. When America and Britain had decided to divide Germany and make the Western Zone a colony, we gave up Berlin politically, and we can't lose anything by giving it up militarily in a search for peace. I'm quoting what Henry Wallace said about what we should do in response to the Berlin blockade. Returning to Bush's quote, as the communist coalition partners and Jan Masaryk had learned at great personal cost, the Czech coup, which was February of 1948, had shown the pitfalls of a policy of trusting coexistence with the Soviets. Indeed, the Czech coup threw the United States into the first war scare of 1948 as Americans wondered if Soviet power would seek to reach out further. Berlin showed as much and more, and the second war scare of 1948 came into full bloom. B-29s, as I already mentioned, were dispatched to England, and Secretary of Defense James Forrestal asked Truman to prepare for the use of atomic bombs, as Soviet publications boldly reminded the Western powers that the Red Army could reach the North Sea, conquer all of Western Europe other than Great Britain, within a few weeks. Given the imbalance of conventional forces in Europe, there could be little doubt that the United States would be forced to resort to the bomb if war came. Undersecretary of the Army William H. Draper Jr. noted, quote, in Berlin, the war clouds were everywhere. It was a question of what hour or day the war might break out. Truman had charted a course of prudent firmness, supported, for the most part, by the public. Wallace, on the other hand, signaled that he would have responded to the challenge by evacuating Berlin. So this is where matters stood over Berlin as a Democratic National Convention loomed. So let's turn now to what the Southerners were up to prior to the commencement of the Democratic National Convention, some of which I've talked about before. The Southern Democrats were in more than a tizzy in early and mid-1948 about President Truman's actions and proposals regarding civil rights. By early 48, as I previously demonstrated, the president had clearly come down on the side of stronger federal civil rights protections. The report of the President's Committee on Civil Rights, which President Truman had appointed in December of 1946, entitled to secure these rights was published in October of 1947. President Truman's State of the Union address on January the 7th of 1948, followed by his special message to a joint session of the Congress on February the 2nd, 1948, taken together, clearly demonstrated where President Truman wanted to take the country on civil rights protections for all American citizens, but most particularly Blacks living in the South under segregation and Jim Crow. With respect to the political calculations behind Truman's civil rights proposals, positions, Andrew Bush writes, as with the decision to support Israel, it's not entirely clear how much of Truman's civil rights foray was a result of conviction and how much the result of political calculation. It is a matter of historical record that Truman's most important campaign strategists urged him to take dramatic steps to appeal to the growing and apparently fluid Black vote. Moreover, the Clifford-Rao memorandum counseled the president that he faced little real risk if he did so. The South, so the argument went, had nowhere else to go. It would grumble, but in the end, vote Democratic. It was also clear that Truman's political task was an urgent one. He was threatened by defections of Black voters, both to the Republican Party, which at the time was the traditional party of Black voters in America, and to Henry Wallace, whose campaign spent considerably effort fighting for them. Bush continues. However, it was clearly the view of the Clifford-Rao memo and other Democratic strategists that Republicans were the greatest threat on the civil rights front. Front runner Thomas Dewey had compiled a strong civil rights record as governor of New York, though the 80th Congress had not taken advantage of the opening created by Truman's vacillation on civil rights, which was happening in 1947. It was the possibility that the solid South might no longer be solid that now unexpectedly put Truman's campaign into jeopardy. In 1948, the danger was not, for the most part, that the South would vote Republican. The danger was that the Southern dissidents might damage, or the Southern dissent might damage the party internally, or that an independent ticket of Southern Democrats might capture enough votes to deprive Truman of the electoral votes that a Democratic presidential candidate could normally count on. The Southerners were devising a strategy of forming a regional bloc to prevent anyone from attaining an electoral college majority. Throughout early 1948, that possibility continued to build. By late April, the Chicago Daily Tribune, no fan of Harry Truman, reported that, quote, political leaders are pondering the possibility the Southern revolt against President Truman may throw the presidential election into the House. Though analysts considered the possibility remote, the Tribune noted that the states of the Confederacy held 127 electoral votes, and the border states another 52. Even more remote but possible was a tie in the House of Representatives, the House of Representative contingency election, which it was called, depending on the outcome of the November congressional election. In fact, and I love this cartoon, look at it closely, during the months leading up to the Democratic National Convention in July, Southern political leaders continually tried to pressure President Truman to soften his stance on civil rights, all without success, as Truman held fast to his position. I stand pat, and you can see there on the doormat, it's civil rights that he's standing on. Dissidents from the Southern states held a conference on May the 10th in Jackson, Mississippi, to chart their strategy. those present were split between those who favored working within the Democratic Party to soften Truman and the party's stance on civil rights, and those who thought they could more likely get their way by bolting and forming a third party. They generally agreed to oppose Truman's civil rights program and to oppose his nomination and election, and to support the nomination and election of someone opposing Truman's program. So they were trying to oppose his civil rights program and still find somebody that would oppose Truman's civil rights program as the time was proceeding to the Democratic Convention. It was specifically agreed by the Southerners at the meeting in May that they would hold another meeting in Birmingham, Alabama shortly after the Democratic National Convention was held, and thereby hold open the possibility of a third party effort if the convention's actions on civil rights was unsatisfactory to them. They were really hoping to get the Democrats to adopt a weak plank on civil rights and nominate an opponent of new civil rights legislation. Andrew Bush concludes his section on this topic with the following paragraph, political commentary. Truman had gambled on civil rights, and it would not be clear whether his political calculations were on target until many months later. In the short run, he had considerably strengthened his appeal to blacks, while incurring greater than anticipated opposition among Southerners, Southern whites, that is. Listen to this sentence that Bush has in his book. This dialectic undoubtedly had its own dynamics. The angrier the Southern Democrats got, the Southern white Democrats got, the more convinced blacks were that Truman was actually proposing to do something serious for them. So that the harsher the Southern white Democrats were in their denouncement of Truman's civil rights proposals, the more black leaders and their followers believed that Harry Truman was definitely and seriously in favor of the proposals and would pursue actions with regard to civil rights legislation. So let's take a breath now and turn to the Democratic nomination, the Democratic Republican Convention. Let's talk about the nomination first. We've already talked in some deal about the challenges Truman faced in seeking the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1948. One of the biggest problems he faced on this front was his declining poll numbers. Based upon Gallup polls, his positive approval rating had declined from a little over 50% at the beginning of 1948 to a pretty miserable 36% in April. If you'll note on that chart, he's back down in the 36% range at least part of the time in the period August, September, and in June and July, which were the convention periods, 38 and 37%. So that was one factor that was facing him. Henry Wallace had taken himself out of the Democratic Party discussion by launching a third party candidacy with the principal support of the members of the Progressive Party and parenthetically, the Communist Party of the United States of America. This represented a split of the Democratic Party, since many, if not most of those who were supportive of Wallace, at least originally, were traditionally Democrats. The possibility of a Southern split was also a distinct possibility, but not a certainty as matters proceeded to the convention. The Southern Democrats had clearly made their opposition to President Truman's re-election known, with a basis for that being their opposition to Truman's civil rights proposals. With Truman's low poll numbers and the splits in the party, actual and potential, many influential Democrats, liberals comprised of New Dealers and Roosevelt administration officials, Southern Democrats to some extent, and several big city bosses, became convinced that Truman could not get reelected and that the Democrats would lose control of the levers of governmental power, they came up with a bright idea that they could entice World War II hero Dwight Eisenhower to accept the Democratic draft as its presidential nominee if they dumped Truman. So, with the preceding matters swirling around the Democratic political scene, 14 Democratic primary elections proceeded with little indication that the incumbent, Harry Truman, would have any problem attaining the Democratic nomination. There were 14 Democratic primaries in 1948. In the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Nebraska, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Oregon, and California, Truman swept preference primaries, winning an average of 92.4% of the primary vote. Andrew Bush writes, without active, overt competition for convention delegates, the president's political agents methodically corralled them in state primaries and in state caucuses. Additionally, President Truman was forced to deal with the developing crisis in Berlin we've already discussed, which came to a head in June, and he took off on his non-political train trip speaking tour through the American West, all of which probably had a greater political impact than I have the time to talk about and evaluate. And I love this cartoon. If you can see all of that on your screen, move the gallery images off so you can see what it says on the right side. As a Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia approached on July 12th, the draft Eisenhower movement reached its crescendo and then came crashing down abruptly. Eisenhower, who had on several occasions denied any interest in a run for the presidency, which didn't seem to dissuade his supporters until just 5 days before the convention was to begin, Eisenhower sent a telegram to very liberal Florida Senator Claude Pepper, who was a dumped Truman draft Eisenhower supporter, where Eisenhower said, quote, no matter under what terms, conditions, or premises a proposal might be couched, I would refuse to accept the nomination. Pretty definitive. There was some efforts made to look to Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas to take Eisenhower's place, which went nowhere as he wasn't an acceptable compromise to many of the draft Eisenhower supporters. Additionally, Douglas disclaimed any interest in an effort to get him nominated, which brought that possibility to a halt. Senator Pepper said he'd be willing to stand in and seek the nomination at the last minute, but was unable to get support from union leaders, and he promptly withdrew his offer. David Pietruszka, in his book on the 1948 election, gives us this summary of where things stood vis-a-vis the Democratic nomination on the eve of the convention and what happened in the way of political drama once the convention convened. And if I can make a prediction here, you're going to love this next part of the lecture. But if it were not Ike, it could be no one but Truman. In late June, Gallup had polled Democrats and revealed that without Eisenhower, any ADA, remember that, Americans for the Democratic Action, any ADA-backed dump Harry move inspired little confidence. The old adage proved true again. You can't beat somebody with nobody. And Gallup's numbers from that poll of Democrats read, Harry Truman, 76%, General George Marshall, 10%, James Byrne, 3%, Harry Byrd, 2%, James Forrestal, 1%, James Farley, 1%, William O. Douglas, 1%, No Choice, 6%. But while the nomination seemed settled, the platform, or at least one key portion of it, did not. The battle that Harry Truman's Civil Rights Commission had ignited was about to erupt into a war to be fought on the convention floor. Southerners angled for a plank affirming the inviolability of states' rights. What we must have, demanded Florida's Charles Shepard, a member of the Platform and Resolutions Committee, what we must have is a plank setting forth in unmistakable terms that this is the United Sovereign States of America. And in it, the states may handle their own internal affairs. They, that is the Southern Democrats, sought to have inserted in the platform the innocuous plank language that had been in the platform 4 years earlier in 1944. To the minorities and party liberals who had accepted that language 4 years earlier, that would no longer suffice to satisfy them, nor would it Truman or his supporters for that matter, and the fight was on. As the NAACP's Walter White insisted, the Democratic Party can demonstrate its right to exist only by adopting an unequivocal position on civil rights, such as the President's committee recommended. If it does not have the courage to cleanse itself of the barnacles of bigotry its Southern wing has affixed to it, it has no right to continue to exist. The day of reckoning has come. Reinforcing White's words were the National Negro Council's actions. In early June, it presented petitions bearing 1.2 million signatures to Truman, Dewey, Robert Taft, and House Speaker Joe Martin, demanding complete implementation of the Truman Civil Rights Program. Democrats, caught in the crossfire of their own contrary internal elements, faced an unexpected threat from the 1948 GOP platform. Quoting Hubert Humphrey now, Republicans had adopted a relatively forward-looking civil rights plank, recalled Humphrey, who at the time was Minneapolis's mayor. If we had been mild, the Republicans might have seized the issue by default. I, that is Humphrey, felt that was ideologically absurd and politically stupid. So I came down hard on the side of a strong civil rights plank, both as a matter of conscience and political pragmatism. This is me now. It's not possible in the time available to do justice to the words that were spoken and the debates that took place in that platform fight. The Southerners, uncompromising, seeking to water down or eliminate the civil rights plank consistent with Truman's proposals. On the other side, the party's liberals not only sought to support the plank of the Truman administration, but to strengthen it. In what may have been the most dramatic convention speech in the 20th century by someone not a nominee, Minneapolis Mayor Hubert Humphrey, a leading liberal voice, urged that there be no hedging, no watering down of Truman's civil rights promise. Let's hear some of what Hubert Humphrey had to say as he addressed the convention and the civil rights plank in that historic moment. And here I am quoting from Humphrey's speech to the convention. We are confronted by emotionalism on all sides, but there is no single religion, no single class, no single racial group. President Truman had the courage to issue a new Emancipation Proclamation. My friends, to those who say that we are rushing this issue of civil rights, I say to them, we are 172 years late. To those who say that this civil rights program is an infringement on states' rights, I say this: the time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunlight of human rights. People, human beings, this is the issue of the 20th century. People of all kinds, all sorts of people. And these people are looking to America for leadership. And they're looking to America for precept and example. My good friends, my fellow Democrats, I ask you for a calm consideration of our historic opportunity. Let us forget the evil passions and the blindness of the past. In these times of world economic, political, and spiritual, above all spiritual crisis, we cannot and we must not turn from the path so plainly before us. That path has already led us through many valleys of the shadow of death. And now is the time to recall those who were left on that path of American freedom. For all of us here, for the millions who have sent us, for the whole 2 billion members of the human family, our land is now more than ever before the last best hope on earth. And I know that we can, and I know that we shall begin here the fuller and richer realization of that hope, that promise of a land where all men are truly free and equal, and each man uses his freedom and equality wisely well. My good friends, I ask my party, I ask the Democratic Party to march down the high road of progressive democracy. I ask this convention to say in unmistakable terms that we proudly hail and courageously support our president and leader, Harry Truman, in his great fight for civil rights in America. Powerful words, if I do say so myself. Columnist Holmes Alexander observed Humphrey's speech and the convention's reaction to it and wrote, quote, "It was the president's name spoken without quibble or apology, which seemed to lift the convention out of its lethargy. The appeal sounded through the convention hall like a trumpet. It proved to all who saw it happen that, regardless of weasel platform words and other failures, this was a liberty-minded convention representing a party that will go down fighting." Andrew Bush writes simply, Humphrey's speech touched off a massive demonstration on the floor of the convention. As the demonstration in the convention wound down, several Southern motions to amend the plank were voted down. The liberal platform plank concerning civil rights, even more liberal than what Truman's convention representatives had proposed, was voted upon, and with the support of the liberals and several of the big city bosses, it passed 651.5 to 582.5. Members of the Alabama delegation, with Bull Connor in the lead, tried to get the attention of Sam Rayburn, who held the gavel as convention chairman. The Southerners hoped to use the obvious drama of the moment to announce their withdrawal from the convention. Rayburn did not give them that satisfaction and adjourned the assemblage until 7 p.m. that evening. Once the convention started up again, the balloting for the presidential nominee came next. Once the process started, 13 members of the Alabama delegation walked out of the convention, followed immediately by the entire Mississippi delegation, marching out under the flag of the Confederacy. The bolters were met with a cascade of boos and jeers from the gallery. After order was restored, the convention proceeded with the balloting. In the end, Truman won the nomination overwhelmingly. Harry Truman settled on Senate Minority Leader Alben Barkley of Kentucky as his running mate, which designation was affirmed by the convention. But the evening was not yet to the point where President Truman could officially accept the nomination with his acceptance speech. That would have to wait, and wait, and wait. David Pietruszka gives us enlightenment on what happened that evening. Pietruszka writes, the convention had deteriorated into near chaos. It should have quickly wrapped up its remaining business. It had not. The balloting and the speeches and the unease dragged on and on. Southern delegates stalked out. It was, as Clark Clifford remembered, perhaps the strangest evening of politics I ever witnessed. In the course of this horridly long evening, Chairman Rayburn had yelled himself hoarse, unsuccessfully pleading for the delegates to hold applause and for the band. I could control this convention if I could run the band, Rayburn said, to keep music to a minimum. They ignored him. With the convention running 3 hours and 43 minutes behind schedule, Rayburn nevertheless undertook one last chore before introducing the exceedingly patient Truman. And you're going to love this. I want to introduce to you Mrs. Emma Guffey Miller, Pennsylvania delegate at large, Rayburn said. She has a surprise for us, which I hope the convention will enjoy. The plump, white-frocked 73-year-old Mrs. Miller, pictured there with Eleanor Roosevelt. Mrs. Miller had prepared an elaborate 6-foot-high floral display composed of red and white carnations in the shape of a Liberty Bell. I looked and I looked and I could not find a picture of that display, darn it. Imprisoned inside this red and white carnation Liberty Bell, imprisoned inside of it for several hours, were 48 caged white pigeons, officially and symbolically designated doves of peace. In the horrid heat, reports were in the air-conditioned convention hall, it was 100 degrees on the floor of the convention. Anyway, in the horrible heat, a couple of those doves of peace had already expired in their cage. The band, when the cage was opened, stoked up "Hail to the Chief," and the surviving birds, crazed by the noise, the lights, and the heat, exploded out of the opened Liberty Bell. All hell broke loose. Pigeons flew into the rafters. They dive-bombed delegates. Men and women shouted, "Watch your clothes!" Though the press delicately did not mention it, noted Clark Clifford, who did, the doves of peace began, not surprisingly, to drop the inevitable product of their hours of imprisonment on any delegate who had the bad luck to be underneath them. Some birds landed on the platform. Rayburn frantically shushed them away. One nearly landed on his glistening bald head. Another headed straight for the blades of a 36-inch electric fan, saved from filleting only by Rayburn's quick action. "Get those damn pigeons out of here," he screamed over live radio and TV. As Truman spoke, Time reported, pigeons teetered on the balconies, on folds in the draperies, on overhead lights, occasionally launched on a quick flight to a more pigeonly position. And that was a report from the next day after the convention had actually ended. Finally, The Democratic nominee, the incumbent, President Harry Truman, took the podium at 2 o'clock in the morning to give his acceptance speech before the delegates in the convention hall. Emotionally spent from the fight over the platform, tired from the late hour, uneasy from the attack of the doves of peace, and generally depressed because of all the prognostications of a Truman Democratic defeat come November, those assembled exhibited little energy and enthusiasm as Truman took the stage. As Truman talked, however, something almost magical happened as he used the speaking style that he had developed during his recent tour out west. He gave a fighting speech that predicted victory in November. He accused the Republican Party of being the party of special interest. He reiterated his position on foreign policy and attacked what he called this last worst 80th Congress for failing to take action on housing, slum clearance, education, price controls, the minimum wage, and civil rights. He attacked the Taft-Hartley Act and the Republican rich man tax cut, both of which had passed over his veto. Though few Americans were listening to his nationally broadcast radio address at 2 a.m., Truman roused the delegates and, more importantly, succeeded in taking the strategic initiative. He was sure to suffer, how much no one knew, from the divisions in his own party. In his nomination acceptance speech, he made a bid to exploit to the fullest the Republican divisions that had been papered over at the GOP convention, divisions traceable, as I've mentioned previously, to 1912, and currently manifest in the contrast in substance and tenor between the party's liberal presidential wing, represented by Tom Dewey, who had gotten the nomination, on one hand, and on the other hand, in their more conservative congressional wing, represented by Robert Taft, who did not get the nomination. Although the president's speech had invigorated them, Democrats still left Philadelphia with serious doubts about their prospects. They were still down in the polls and still contending with a three-way split that threatened to fatally diminish their vote. But they knew that if they were to go down, they would go down fighting. Truman, with perhaps a keener understanding of his underlying advantages, was more confident. So what does Harry Truman himself tell us in his memoirs about this moment in time? Quoting now from volume 2 of Harry Truman's memoirs. At 2 a.m., I was escorted to the convention floor above and onto the speaker's platform. The huge hall was packed with weary, perspiring delegates who had spent 3 days and nights in Bedlam. They were still capable of making noise, however, and they greeted me with thunderous applause. But it was clear to me that the work of the opposition in propagandizing against my chances of winning, plus the splintering within our own party, had taken its toll. The Democratic Party was dispirited and dejected. I meant to give them something to cheer about and something to campaign for. I had studied the acceptance speeches of 2 or 3 other presidents, principally Roosevelt's, and had made up my mind that I would spring my first big surprise of the campaign in that speech. It took only a short sentence to bring the delegates to their feet. That was when I said, Senator Barkley and I will win this election and make these Republicans like it. Don't you forget it. I meant just that, and I said it as if I meant it. There could be no mistake. I intended to win. I made a tough, fighting speech. I listed in detail the failures of the Republican-controlled Congress, and I did not pull any punches. Then, toward the end of the speech, I played my trump card. I announced, here he quotes from his speech, on the 26th day of July, which out in Missouri we call Turnip Day, I am going to call Congress back and ask them to pass laws to halt rising prices, to meet the housing crisis, which they are saying they are for in their platform. At the same time, I shall ask them to act upon vitally needed measures which they say they are for. Back to his campaign or his nominated and acceptance speech. Now, my friends, if there is any reality behind that Republican platform, we ought to get some action from a short session of the 80th Congress. They can do this job in 15 days if they want to do it. They will still have time to go out and run for office. They are going to try to dodge their responsibility. They are going to drag all the red herrings they can across this campaign. But I am here to say that Senator Barkley and I are not going to let them get away with it. This announcement of a special session of the Congress electrified the convention to a new pitch of confidence and enthusiasm. I was telling the Democrats that we were calling the bluff of the Republican opposition and that we were going to fight them with everything we had. Just as I had predicted, this is back to Truman's memoirs there, just as I had predicted, the turnip day session of the Congress came and went with any response to my demands for construction, came and went with any constructive demands for my constructive legislation promised by the Republican Party platform. The Republican leaders turned a deaf ear to my warning that the American people would expect some kind of action before the election and ignored the recommendations which I made in a 6-page message on July 27th, right after that session had started. After 2 weeks of doing nothing, the special session adjourned. The stage was now set for the active 1948 presidential campaign. I picked Labor Day, which was on September the 6th, to sound the starting gun of my bid for the presidency, and most of my opponents did the same. The campaign was built on one issue: the interests of the people, as represented by the Democrats, against the special interests as represented by the Republicans, and the record of the 80th Congress. I staked the race for the presidency on that one issue. So what did the Dixiecrats do now that the convention was over? Southerners unhappy with Truman's record on civil rights and the plank of the civil rights adopted at the convention met in Birmingham on July 17th, just 3 days after the Democratic convention concluded. They decided to form the third party, which they named the States' Rights Democratic Party, which became commonly known as the Dixiecrats. As we've discussed before in this class, they nominated Governor Strom Thurmon of South Carolina as their presidential candidate and Mississippi Governor Fielding L. Wright as their vice presidential nominee. The Progressive Party. 1 week later, the delegates of Henry Wallace's new party met, also in Philadelphia, and officially adopted the Progressive Party as their official name. They designated Henry Wallace, who we've discussed in detail before, as their presidential nominee, and named Idaho Democratic Senator Glenn Taylor their vice presidential nominee. So what else happened before the campaign really kicked off? What did President Truman do? President Truman wasn't done proposing and taking affirmative action concerning civil rights, and at the same time appealing to liberals and black voters and sticking his thumb in the eyes of the formerly Democratic, now Dixiecrat, Southern dissidents and conservatives in general. In the summer of 1947, when President Truman gave a speech to the National Convention of the NAACP in June at the Lincoln Memorial, one of the things he said was, quoting, "Recent events in the United States and abroad have made us realize that it is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. When I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. Our national government must show the way." As we have seen, President Truman was good to his word in the months that followed. As another step along this road, on July the 26th, 1948, President Truman issued Executive Orders 9980 and 9981, which ordered the desegregation of the federal workforce and the desegregation of the United States military services. These executive orders were intended by President Truman to extend equal opportunities to blacks in federal employment and in the U.S. Armed Forces. Probably not by coincidence, these orders were issued on Turnip Day, the date set for the special session of Congress by President Truman in his nomination acceptance speech. Andrew Bush points out, the critical factor driving Truman's decision from a policy standpoint was that draft registration was scheduled to start on August the 10th, and it was clear that some determination needed to be reached by that time. The political factor was obvious. On one hand, the South would scream, but it was already clear that the hardcore segregationists were lost to Truman and unlikely to be further strengthened by any action he might take regarding the armed forces. On the other hand, Henry Wallace, though generally weakened, still posed an indeterminate threat in crucial states, including New York and California, where Truman was angling hard for the black vote. So what else was happening in this time period? I'm going to turn now to what I'm going to call the second U.S. Red Scare, communists in government. Wikipedia says a Red Scare is the promotion of a widespread fear of a potential rise of communism or anarchism in a society or state. The term is most often used to refer to two periods in the history of the United States, which are referred to by this term. The first Red Scare, which occurred immediately after World War I, revolved around a perceived threat in the U.S., a perceived threat to the U.S. form of government from the American labor movement, anarchist revolution, and political radicalism, the first Red Scare. The second Red Scare, which occurred immediately after World War II, was preoccupied with the perception that national or foreign communists were infiltrating or subverting U.S. society and the federal government. After World War II, there was an increased and popular fear of communist espionage in the United States that was a consequence of the increasing tensions of the Cold War, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the Berlin Blockade, and revelations or accusations of communists or communist sympathizers in the government. On March the 21st, 1947, going back a year or so, in reaction to this Red Scare then, concerned with Soviet subversive penetration and infiltration into the US government by American citizens who held oaths. So anyway, Truman adopted Executive Order 9835, which imposed a loyalty oath and background investigations on persons deemed suspicious of holding party memberships in organizations that advocated violent and anti-democratic programs for people working in the federal workforce. During the summer of 1948, new allegations surfaced regarding communists in government. There was testimony before a Senate Intelligence Subcommittee that a staffer on the Council of Economic Advisors was a Soviet spy. In hearings before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where a former Soviet agent named Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Henry Dexter White, who I've mentioned before, a former FDR economic advisor, and an aide to Henry Wallace, was identified as a Soviet agent. On August the 3rd, Whittaker Chambers, this is 1948 now, Whittaker Chambers, a former Soviet intelligence courier, said that he and Alger Hiss, a name that you've probably heard before, former assistant to the Secretary of State, that they had both been members of the Communist Party. These accusations, not only as to Chambers, but as to Alger Hiss himself, rocked Washington and added to the concerns about communist infiltration into government in the US. Remember, this is August of 1948. The presidential campaign didn't kick off until Labor Day, September the 6th. So all of these multitude of events that I've been talking about were swirling around in the public's mind and in the public knowledge as the campaign for the presidency kicked off in 1948. I bring these matters up to demonstrate the mentality of official Washington, government officials, and the people of the United States at large in this time period. The effect of these and other revelations on the 1948 elections is certainly not clear, but it's pretty clear that this news kept the second Red Scare alive in the United States and ultimately led to the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy and his control of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which didn't actually happen until 1950. The candidate most directly impacted by the second Red Scare was Henry Wallace, whose communist connections gradually eroded whatever significant support he had at the end of 1947 and earlier 1948 as matters drew nearer to the presidential campaign. So I turn now to the presidential campaign. Although it was clear that the candidates nominated by the Democratic, Republican, and Progressive parties had been campaigning for the presidential election for some time, they didn't really take to the campaign trail for the general election until September, Labor Day, the traditional time to kick off a presidential campaign. In this case, Labor Day fell on September the 6th. Andrew Bush gives us this narrative to the start of Truman's fall campaign on Labor Day 1948. Truman opened his fall campaign on Labor Day in Cadillac Square in Detroit, where he predicted to 150,000 laborers that if Republicans won Congress and the presidency, you men of labor can expect to be hit by a steady barrage of body blows. Calling his opponents reactionaries with calculating machines where their hearts ought to be, Truman exhorted that labor must fight now harder than ever before to make sure that its rights are kept intact. His Labor Day speech caught, his Labor Day speech caught the essence of Truman's message for the next 2 months. He and his strategist has long before identified most of the key groups, liberals, blacks, labor, and the West, to which they added veterans and proposed extra attention to labor and blacks after the conventions. And the key messages, the president as a crusading leader, fighting for the New Deal at home, and peace through firmness abroad, while connecting Dewey to the 80th Congress, that being the strategy. Truman spent the remainder of the campaign sending this message to the voters with ferocity and a discipline that have not been surpassed by any presidential candidate in the modern era. As his biographer, David McCullough, noted, when it came to his message, Truman had just one strategy: attack, attack, attack. Carry the fight to the enemy camp. Next, Andrew Bush writes about Tom Dewey's campaign. For his part, Dewey had a campaign born, like Truman's, of a combination of conviction and practical calculation. The challenger's strategy was to rise above the fray, focusing on the importance of national unity and conveying a dignified presidential image to the point of running as if he were the incumbent. To be sure, he would promise a clean sweep of Washington, but would rarely issue a detailed indictment, much less a passionate one. There were clear practical reasons that Dewey and his circle adopted this strategy. One was that the governor, by every available indication, was leading the race by a sizable margin. Why rock the boat? Dewey asked. Another consideration was that Truman's style could easily be seen as unpresidential, even demagogic, meaning that a more restrained campaign approach by Dewey could conceivably put him in a better light than the incumbent. Not least, Dewey was a former prosecutor who was by nature combative and who had run what was widely seen as an extremely aggressive campaign against Franklin Roosevelt in 1944. He and his advisors generally calculated that a return of the 1944 Dewey would bring back negative memories among voters and could well be politically fatal. It would be a mistake, though, to see the high-level strategy as purely a matter of calculation. The governor and his advisors were convinced that campaigns do not matter much, that few voters would change their minds after the summer. If that was the case, Dewey had already won and must conduct his campaign in the manner most likely to lead to a successful presidency, not necessarily worried about the campaign. This meant, among other things, not burning his bridges to the opposition and not tying himself down with overly specific promises. Dewey also seemed to genuinely believe that national well-being and safety in an unsettled and dangerous time, such as 1948 called for, with a minimum of acrimony directed at the president, was a good approach. On more than one occasion in the fall 1948 campaign, he would refrain from taking partisan advantage of national security issues that offered partisan gain. Moreover, the Berlin crisis caused him to curtail criticism of the president on foreign policy issues. He too ran a disciplined campaign, almost uniformly sticking to his team's game plan, despite his growing misgivings and a personal desire to hit Truman back hard. One analyst wrote that Truman faced a difficult task as time for the fall campaigns approached. If the polls were correct, if the polls were accurate, Dewey needed only to hold the support that he had already acquired and hope that most of the Wallace people resulted the temptation to vote for the lesser evil, that is, for Truman. The president had a tougher assignment. In addition to maintaining the loyalty of those who favored him, he had to convert both the uncertain and some of those who at present seemed devoted to his opponents. However, many of those leaning toward Dewey or Wallace had strong Democratic inclinations and had voted for Roosevelt in the past. Truman simply had to persuade them that a Democratic Party was, after all, their natural home, and that he was a deserving heir of FDR. I'll get to Truman's famous Whistlestop campaign shortly, but to give you a flavor of the perceptions of the candidates and their candidacies as the campaign progressed by at least one journalistic observer who sent the following letter to the editor, which ran in Time magazine in its October 25th issue. Sir, let me tell you how things look to me. Tom Dewey is running for president of Rotary International. Harry Truman is running for mayor of Independence. Mr. Strom Thurmon is running for president of the Confederate States of America. Henry Wallace is running for president of the Soviet Union. The only man who seems to be running for national office is Earl Weaver. He's running for vice president of the United States. We've had a vice president for the last 3 years, referring, of course, to Harry Truman. I'm running for cover. So with that, I turn to the Whistlestop campaign. With the official Labor Day kickoff of the campaign, the presidential election itself was only 2 months away, or less than that, on November the 2nd. Harry Truman, as we mentioned, was faced with all those things. I think let me get my slides here. Yeah. So Truman, the incumbent, was faced with the reality that he was the underdog. I'll go back to that, sorry. There. His opponent, Dewey, never trailed in a Gallup poll after March, and Dewey held an 8-point lead heading into September. Truman was still smarting of the results of the 46 midterms. The 46 midterms were held on November the 5th of 46 and resulted in the election of the members of the 80th Congress. It was the first election after World War II where, well, actually since before World War II, where the Democratic Party had suffered losses. After having been in the minority of both houses of Congress since 1932, Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate in 46. On top of that, Truman was faced with the split of the party, which we've talked about in detail. As if the foregoing was not enough doom and gloom for the Democratic Party and President Truman, most of the press repeatedly sent out a negative drumbeat about the president and his capacity to lead the country as its president and the slim chances for his reelection. So what could Harry Truman do to reverse all of the signs that pointed to his imminent defeat in November and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat? Truman was not kidding when he made his acceptance speech following his nomination at the convention. He also recognized the response he had received from the delegates at the convention, the faithful gathered in Philadelphia in the early morning hours of July 15th, when he opened his speech with these words: "Senator Barkley and I will win this election and make these Republicans like it. Don't you forget that." As Truman wrote in his memoirs, "I meant just that, and I said it as I meant it. There could be no mistake. I intended to win." As I've already mentioned, Truman had called the bluff of the Republican 80th Congress by calling it into special session for 2 weeks, during which time they failed to respond favorably to Truman's call for legislation that was consistent with the Republican platform, giving Truman an ideal campaign issue. His opening volley of the official campaign, as I've already mentioned, was to a crowd of 150,000 laborers in Detroit, where he laid the gauntlet to the voters. In his memoirs, President Truman tells us what he did next to take his case to the American people. "On September the 17th, I began an extended tour. I had warned my staff and the reporters who prepared to make the trip with me that I was going to win the election. I'm going to fight hard," I told Senator Barkley. "I'm going to give them hell. We should be on the road most of the time for the next 6 weeks, getting up at all hours to make stops at any place where people wanted to see me." At first, critics referred to my tour as a one-man circus and called it less efficient and less dignified than the campaign being put on by the Republicans. But as the crowds grew larger and larger and more people flocked to my train than showed up around the Dewey train, our opponents began to get worried. David Pietruszka gives us this perspective. "Harry Truman coveted but one pearl, re-election, and he knew exactly how to pry it loose. He would hammer the Republican Party at every turn, targeting its dignified, non-ideological standard bearer, as well as its decidedly slightly less sonorous and less liberal representatives in the 80th Congress. He would move left to pound Henry Wallace, pilfer his domestic issues, and woo back millions of his voters. He would, when necessary, swerve right to decry Wallace as a dupe of the pinks and the reds. He would studiously ignore his erstwhile Southern allies. Above all, he would ride the rails. His June pilgrimage to Berkeley provided the blueprint. He had rolled his campaign out for its test drive, visiting the hustings as he had so desperately done in his second senatorial campaign in 1940. He would buttonhole voters at every inglorious whistle stop, try out the Mrs. and Miss Margaret, and above all, attack, attack, attack. How sincerely he believed in his slim chances remained open to question. Certainly, few other Democrats possessed such confidence. David McCullough writes, "The Ferdinand Magellan was the only private railroad car ever fitted out for the exclusive use of the President of the United States. 83 feet in length and painted the standard green of the Pullman Company, it had been built originally in 1928 as one of several luxury cars named for famous explorers, then taken over by the government for Franklin Roosevelt's use during wartime in 1942, when it was completely overhauled to become a rolling fortress. The windows were 3-inch bulletproof glass. The entire car sheathed in armor plate, sides, top, bottom, ends, and doors, with the result being that it weighed a colossal 142.5 tons, or as much as a locomotive. Special trucks and wheels had to be built to carry the weight. For security reasons, during the war, only the word Pullman appeared on the outside, and still in 1948, the only distinguishing exterior features were the presidential seal fixed to the rear platform and 3 loudspeakers mounted on the top of the platform roof. Inside, everything was designed for comfort. To Truman, who loved trains and loved seeing the country, it was the perfect way to travel." This is still McCullough. On September 17, 1948, the Magellan, at the end of a 17-car special train, stood waiting on track 15 beneath the cavernous shed of Washington's Union Station. Now on what was to become famous as the Whistlestop Campaign, Truman would travel, all told, 21,928 miles, as far nearly as around the world, as far nearly as the voyage of Magellan. The idea was his own. "I want to see the people," he had said. There would be 3 major tours. First, cross-country to California, again for 15 days. Then a 6-day tour of the Middle West, followed by a final hard-hitting 10 days in the big population centers of the Northeast, and a return trip home to Missouri. Bush tells us, on September 17th, the president left on the Ferdinand Magellan for an extended campaign excursion by train, an excursion that took him cross-country to California and back to the capital via Texas and Oklahoma. The next day, at the National Plowing Contest in Dexter, Iowa, Truman labeled his opponents as cunning men who want a return of the Wall Street economic dictatorship. Republicans had, quote, plunged a pitchfork into the back of farmers, and what the Republicans had stolen from the farmers, what, quote, only an appetizer for the economic tapeworm of big business. At other campaign stops in Denver, Reno, and El Paso, the president declared that Republicans planned to turn the West into an economic colony of Wall Street, that congressional Republicans were silent and cunning men who have developed a dangerous lust for power and privilege, that his opponents hoped to abolish farm price supports altogether, and that economic royalists were terribly anxious to take over the country again, a veiled threat of a return to the Depression. In general, Truman worked hard to present himself as a worthy heir to FDR. To lay the foundation for this argument, he referred frequently to Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression. At times, he seemed to be running against Hoover as much as against Dewey. Truman used similar words to attack Dewey and the Republicans as he sought to appeal to other constituencies, to the labor voters. He made it clear that he opposed the Republican enacted Taft-Hartley Act and would seek to repeal it. Regarding black voters, he largely let his actions on their behalf speak for themselves. As he had told his sister, Mary Jane, in a letter to her, he attacked, and attacked. And election day drew even nearer. One story that President Truman gives in his memoirs illustrates what was happening on his Whistlestop campaign. The trip across Ohio from Cincinnati to Cleveland was made in the daytime on the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton Railroad. which goes through a whole string of little towns. And the crowds there were immense. Former Governor Lausch, who was a candidate for the governorship of Ohio, got on a train just south of Columbus, intending to get off again at Columbus. At that little town where Lausch got on, there was a crowd of from 6,000 to 8,000 people. And at the next town, the crowd was even larger. At Columbus, the crowd was so big they could not even get into the station. Is this the way all crowds have been? The governor asked. Yes, I said, that is Truman, but this is smaller than we had in some states. Well, Lausch said, this is the biggest crowd I ever saw in Ohio. And he rode on to Cleveland with us rather than getting off in Columbus. He gave our ticket his fullest support. It was quite a campaign. I worked my staff almost to death. I believe at one time or another, I put them all to bed, and despite its long hours and hard work, I gained weight during the campaign. I worked the reporters very hard too. The major opinion polls, public opinion polls, meanwhile continued through the press and over the air up to the very day of the election to predict my defeat. Truman tells us in his memoirs that he traveled a total of 31,700 miles on his whistle stops, contradicting David McCullough by about 10,000 miles. Truman was known to exaggerate, and delivered in excess of 300 speeches, 356 to be exact, according to Truman. According to Truman's telling, 12 to 15 million people had turned out to see him on his campaign tour from one end of the country to the other. He felt as though the people responded with increasing enthusiasm as the day of the election neared. I'll let Harry Truman's words take us to the conclusion of the campaign. On October 31st, 1948, I returned from the bedlam of the longest and hardest political campaign of my career to the restful quiet of my home in Independence. The tumultuous weeks of speech-making, handshaking, and traveling day and night had culminated in St. Louis the night before in a tremendous rally. I felt that I had given the voters a clearer view of the choice before them, and that the response from the grassroots of America was so great that it would carry me back to the White House for 4 years as an elected president. The following day, which was the eve of the election, I made 2 more speeches. The second one, that night, I spoke from the living room of my home to about 70 million Americans listening over the 4 major radio networks. This was my final appeal to the voters to decide between the principles of the party for the people and the party for the special interests. I warned the nation that their vote would not be just for one man or another, but would affect every person in his family for years to come. With that, I was through. There was nothing to do but wait for the results. Election Day, November the 2nd, 1948. On Election Day, November the 2nd, November the 2nd, Truman was up at 5 a.m., took his usual morning walk, read the papers, and had breakfast. After breakfast, he gathered up Bess and Margaret and headed to the Memorial Building, or Memorial Hall, just 3 blocks away from the Truman House on Delaware, where all 3 cast their ballots. They were followed by a swarm of reporters and photographers to document the event. The final poll by the Gallup organization on the eve of the election reflected that he had reduced Dewey's lead, but Dewey still maintained a 5-point margin, 49.5 to 44.5. David McCullough writes, "The New York Times predicted a Dewey victory. Time and Newsweek said saw a Dewey sweep. The new issue of Time carried a full-page photograph of Dewey, the next president. Alastair Cook, correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, titled his dispatch for November the 1st, Harry Truman, a Study in Failure." I'll let President Truman take it from here. At 4:30 in the afternoon of Election Day, my Secret Service detail drove with me from my home down to the Elms Hotel at Excelsior Springs, Missouri. We had slipped away from the reporters who spent the rest of the night trying to find me. They kept telephoning my family in Independence, hoping to get some information. At Excelsior Springs, after taking a Turkish bath, I went upstairs to my room at 6:30, had a ham sandwich and a glass of milk. Other stories say a glass of buttermilk, but this is what Truman said. Turned on the radio to listen to some of the Eastern returns, and then went to bed. I was reported some thousands ahead. I woke at midnight and again listened to the radio broadcast of Mr. H.V. Kaltenborn. I was about 1,200,000 ahead on the count, but according to this broadcaster, was still undoubtedly beaten. About 4 o'clock in the morning, one of my Secret Service men came into my room and advised me to tune in on Kaltenborn's broadcast. I did so and learned that at that time, I was over 2 million ahead. But the commentator continued to say he couldn't see how I could be elected. I told my Secret Service men that we had better go back to Kansas City because it looked very much as if we were in for another 4 years. And we arrived in Kansas City, went to the Muehlbach Hotel, his campaign headquarters, at about 6 o'clock Wednesday morning, November the 3rd. At 10:30 that morning, I received a telegram from Governor Dewey congratulating me on my election. The final figures showed that I had received 24,105,695 votes, to be precise, carrying 28 states. Dewey had 21,969,000 votes, carrying 16 states. Wallace and Thurmon polled slightly over 1 million votes each. I lost 4 of the southern states to the Dixiecrats: South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. My majority in the Electoral College, which you can see there on that chart, was greater than my popular majority. The 1948 election proved the pollsters and forecasters so wrong and unreliable that to this day, which when he wrote that was 1955, their reputations have not been fully restored and their influence is much reduced. It was almost universally predicted right up to the last minute that I would lose the election. It was a historic victory, not only for Truman, but for the party. The Democrats recaptured the Republican House by a landslide and obtained control of the Senate as well. My long campaign against the 80th Congress had convinced the voters that a turnout was necessary, and I was given an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress to replace the one which had blocked the administration's domestic program for 2 years. 2 days after the election, the presidential train took me to Washington. There was a great demonstration in the Union Station in St. Louis. As an aside from what Truman wrote in his memoirs, Dewey Defeats Truman was an incorrect headline on the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune on the day after Truman defeated Dewey. When Truman was passing through St. Louis on the way to Washington, he stepped to the rear platform of his train car, the Ferdinand Magellan, and was handed a copy of the Tribune early edition. Happy, I think beyond happy, to exult in the paper's error, he held it up for photographers gathered at the station, and the famous picture was taken. Truman reportedly smiled and said, "That ain't the way I heard it." Returning to Truman's memoirs, and when I arrived in the capital city, one of the largest crowds I have ever seen in Washington took part in a homecoming celebration. As the Vice President-elect and I rode up Pennsylvania Avenue to the plaudits of immense crowds, I saw a sign on the front of the Washington Post building which said, "Mr. President, we are ready to eat crow whenever you are ready to serve it." That picture there, which you can't hardly read, says, "Welcome, Truman, from the Crow Eaters." That's the front of the Washington Post building at the time. Truman says, "I sent that great newspaper word that I did not want anyone to eat crow, that I was not elated or in a mood myself to crow over anyone. I said I felt the tremendous responsibility that was mine for the next 4 years, and that I hoped for the support of all the people in carrying out the program which I thought they had entrusted me to accomplish." On arriving at the White House, I had a cabinet meeting and a series of conferences to plan immediate repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act as promised in the campaign. There was much work to be done, and I was eager to get on with that work. That's it. I don't know about you guys, but I'm pooped.
David, Judy did put in the chat box asking if the Pullman car that you showed us the picture of is the one that is on display downtown at the Kansas City Southern headquarters.
I don't really know that for sure. Somebody could probably Google that and find out, but I rather doubt it. I would think if it was going to be down there, there'd be a big deal about it. But I could be completely wrong. It may be there temporarily or permanently on display. I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe somebody with quick fingers can Google that Union Station piece of information.
Other questions for David?
Sorry. Yeah. I'll try to be quiet and listen.
Remember that you need to unmute yourself in order to ask your questions.
And I appreciate those of you that stayed with me this long. I know I went over, but I didn't want to leave this hanging with where we had been and where we headed. So I hope you enjoyed staying with me to the extent that you did.
David,
That was wonderful, David.
while you were lecturing, I was looking up Truman's age at election, and it never told me, but I figured out that he must have been right at 64. Is that what you have?
He was born in 1884.
Right.
He was 61 on BE Day, which was May the 8th of 1945. So we would have been 4 years after that. So we would have been 65. Is that what you said?
Well, I said 64, but that probably wasn't quite at election time.
Yeah. By the election, he would turn 65 in May of 19. Wait a minute, I'm a year off. You're correct. 1948 would have been 4 years later. Yeah, 64. That's right.
Okay. The other thing that it was just a happen chance is that he is listed as the poorest president elected.
I think that's speaking. Yeah, I think that's speaking from a financial standpoint.
Yeah, they said that he was substantially under $1 million.
Yes. Let's just say substantially is an understatement. Susan, when he left the presidency, the only income that he had that he could depend on regularly was less than $150 a month from his military involvement. There was no presidential pension at the time, and the family had not sold the farm out by Grandview, which happened later on in the 50s when they sold that ground to the people that developed the Truman Corner Shopping Center. So essentially, he didn't have squat from a financial standpoint.
David, we look forward to Truman 7.
Absolutely.
We'll have to talk about the timing of that. Randy Rhodes is, Randy, why don't you unmute yourself and say what you chatted there?
Well, I just checked Google and it says the Ferdinand Magellan is located in Miami County, Florida. Miami-Dade County, Florida, in a museum down there.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
somebody else might look up Pullman Car Union Station and see what they say about a Pullman car being on display there. It may just be a representation of a Pullman car, which was a significant car on trains back in those days.
No, it's at the Kansas City Southern headquarters.
Okay.
The whole back part of it.
It's just a Pullman car.
There's a Pullman car there, and for
Okay.
some reason I'm thinking that's it, but I'll check.
Okay. Yeah, it was one of a kind. Other questions or comments, ideas?
David, Jerry Carey here.
Yeah.
I think it's really a coincidence of history of Minneapolis, the speech of Hubert Humphrey and the connection with George Floyd that we have today. It's a remarkable coincidence of events.
Well, if I can comment on that without getting too political, I have been astounded as I prepared these lectures more than once, especially with totality. I spent a lot of time talking about civil rights here for a reason. Twofold. Number one, it was a significant event when it happened back in 1948 and 47, and the positions that Truman took relative to civil rights and the proposals he made and all that sort of business. But the comparison between the words and the actions that he took in 1948 compared to what we're seeing and hearing today, it's such a stark contrast that I can't help just be struck by the difference in leadership that's been provided in those two different periods of time. And I would guess you guys have sensed that same thing as well. It's just blown me away. And the timing of this class and talking about this has, I think, made us perhaps better voters as we go forward, more informed.
David, Bill Webb,
Yeah, Bill.
we have seen in recent, a few, not very often, the effects of a third party, how that one party has a third party break off and they lose the election. It's almost incredible that in Truman's case, two parties broke away and he still won the election.
Well, it's even more incredible in that, Bill, because both of the parties that broke away were folks that were traditionally Democratic. You know, Wallace had been a Democrat, Strom Thurmon had been a Democrat. Most of the people that called themselves progressives had traditionally been Democratic. They ended up disagreeing over foreign policy matters and were more left-leaning and socialist, perhaps communistic, than the liberals who stayed with the party. So that was a block of votes that would have otherwise been Democratic. They wouldn't have been Republican. And this was the beginning of the breakdown of the solid South as a Democratic voting bloc. Now you look across the South, and a lot of the folks from the South are Republicans. So that wasn't the case in the 40s and the 50s. They were predominantly Democrats, but they disagreed with Truman violently over the Civil Rights Program. So yeah, those splits were both splits off of the Democratic Party. And yet he still got more votes than Dewey got. And in more recent years, Ross Perot's involvement in a third-party campaign, if I've got my history right, probably led to George H.W. Bush's defeat in his second campaign. And I think there's another one where that happened, but I'm drawing a blank on what that was. Apparently,
Thank you, David.
Yeah. Who's that?
Thank you, David.
Speak up, I'm sorry.
I just said thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Well, I hear the clock on the wall striking noon. I think that's what that is.
Yeah, that's our clock, Dave. Sorry.
Sorry, Randy. Well, unless somebody has some burning desire to talk about something else related to this saga of the man from Independence, Harry Truman, and the fact that he got reelected to the presidency in 1948 against all odds and commentators and all that sort of business, I'll let you go and wish you well and be safe and be healthy.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Thank you, David.